What if the nation that stood tallest against tyranny ended the war on its knees? What transforms an empire that ruled a quarter of the earth into a debtor scrambling for loans? And why did victory cost Britain more than defeat cost some of its enemies? December 1940. Winston Churchill writes through the night in his underground war rooms, cigar smoke curling toward the concrete ceiling. Outside, incendiaries rain on London. The letter he's composing will cross the Atlantic in a diplomatic pouch, but its message is stark enough to send unencrypted. Great Britain is running out of money. Not metaphorically, not eventually. Now, the Prime Minister doesn't use the word bankruptcy. Politicians rarely do, but his meaning lands clear as a hammer. Britain needs American ships, American steel, American oil, and American grain. The problem is simpler than strategy and more humiliating than military defeat. The Treasury can no longer pay for any of it. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I'd love to know who's exploring history with me today. Before war broke out in September 1939, Britain commanded financial respect that matched its territorial reach. The Bank of England held gold reserves worth billions. British investors owned rubber plantations in Malaya, tin mines in Bolivia, insurance syndicates in every port from Singapore to Buenos Aires. When the city of London sneezed, markets in Bombay caught cold. This was the nation that had financed the defeat of Napoleon, underwrote the Industrial Revolution, and coined the phrase, "the sun never sets." Then Adolf Hitler invaded Poland, and everything accelerated. Modern industrialized warfare devours resources with shocking speed. A single Lancaster bomber required 55,000 individual parts. Each soldier needed boots, rifles, uniforms, rations, and ammunition, multiplied across millions. Britain produced some of this domestically, but the island had long ago stopped being self-sufficient. It imported 2/3 of its food. It had virtually no domestic oil. Its aluminum came from Canada, its rubber from Southeast Asia, its steel alloys from a dozen different sources. When the Germans overran France and the Low Countries in spring 1940, those continental supply lines snapped. That left one option, the United States. America, in 1940, possessed industrial capacity Britain could only dream of. Its factories ran unthreatened by bombers. Its workforce was vast. Its farmland stretched across a continent. But America was neutral, bound by legislation specifically designed to avoid repeating the mistakes of World War I, when loans to the Allies had eventually pulled the U.S. into combat. The Neutrality Acts of the mid-1930s erected a legal wall. Any nation at war could purchase American goods under one condition: cash and carry, pay in full in dollars or gold before the cargo leaves port. Transport it on your own vessels at your own risk. No credit, no loans, no exceptions. The reasoning was coldly practical. If Britain got bombed into submission, American banks wouldn't be left holding worthless IOUs. So Britain paid. For the first year of war, His Majesty's government liquidated centuries of accumulated wealth. Gold bars traveled by warship and converted luxury liner from London to Halifax and Montreal in convoys designated Operation Fish, the largest physical movement of treasure in recorded history. Securities, bonds, and stock certificates followed. Anything convertible to dollars was converted. By autumn 1940, the gold was gone. The easily liquidated assets were exhausted. Orders for aircraft and ammunition sat unsigned on desks in Washington because the British Purchasing Commission couldn't guarantee payment. Churchill's December letter to President Franklin Roosevelt was a confession wrapped in diplomatic language. Without American aid, Britain would have to seek terms with Germany. Roosevelt grasped the strategic reality immediately. If Britain fell, the Atlantic became a German lake. American security depended on keeping Britain in the fight. But Roosevelt also faced furious political constraints. Congress controlled spending. The public opposed involvement. He needed a mechanism that looked like shrewd business rather than charity, something that wouldn't ignite isolationist fury. The answer emerged in early 1941, Lend-Lease. Roosevelt sold it to the American people with a neighborly metaphor. If your neighbor's house catches fire, you lend him your garden hose without negotiating payment terms. You help and settle accounts later. It sounded generous. Newspapers praised it. Congress, after bitter debate, passed the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941. Behind that public facade, the negotiations were merciless. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. admired British courage and despised fascism, but he served American interests first. His instructions were explicit. Before the United States provided $1 of aid, Britain must prove it had stripped itself of every remaining asset. Morgenthau demanded a complete financial audit. British negotiators, led by Treasury official Sir Frederick Phillips, had to compile inventories of every investment, every overseas holding, every piece of property owned by British entities anywhere on American soil. They were being treated not as allies, but as debtors in receivership. The most painful surrender involved American Viscose Corporation. This company manufactured rayon and employed thousands in the United States. It was owned by the British firm Courtaulds and generated millions annually in dividends that flowed back to London. It was profitable, strategically valuable, and worth, by any reasonable valuation, well over $100 million. Morgenthau identified it as a target. He told the British they had to sell it. When they resisted, he applied leverage. Isolationist senators were attacking Lend-Lease in committee, claiming Britain was secretly wealthy. Morgenthau needed proof of British destitution. Sell Viscose or watch Lend-Lease die. In March 1941, under direct pressure from Washington, the British government seized American Viscose from Courtaulds under emergency wartime powers and forced a sale. Because the transaction was compulsory and rushed, the buyers knew Britain had no negotiating position. The final price came in around $54 million, half what the company was demonstrably worth. The proceeds went straight into the U.S. Treasury to offset prior weapons purchases. Britain didn't even keep the money. There's a common belief that Lend-Lease was simply American generosity, a one-way flow of tanks and planes to save democracy. That's not quite accurate. Lend-Lease involved vast transfers of military equipment, true, but it also involved calculated asset extractions that permanently weakened British economic sovereignty. Take the Destroyers for Bases deal of September 1940, finalized just before Lend-Lease formalized. Britain desperately needed convoy escorts to fight German submarines. Roosevelt agreed to transfer 50 old destroyers, World War I-era vessels of marginal combat value, rusting in reserve. In exchange, the United States received 99-year leases on British military bases stretching from Newfoundland to British Guiana, including strategically vital locations in Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and Trinidad. Britain traded permanent military access across the Western Hemisphere for ships that were obsolescent before they left dock. It was a transaction born of desperation, one that granted the United States a defensive perimeter and power projection capability that would last generations. Then there was Article 7 of the Lend-Lease Agreement. Buried in the legal text was a clause requiring Britain to eliminate imperial preference after the war. Imperial preference was the tariff system that gave trade advantages to empire members. Canada, Australia, India, and others bought British goods at preferential rates, which kept British industry competitive against more efficient American manufacturers. By signing Article 7, Britain agreed to dismantle the economic scaffolding that held its empire together. It was a condition that guaranteed American commercial expansion into markets previously reserved for British firms. British negotiators recognized the poison, but the Luftwaffe was overhead, and the U-boats were hunting convoys. They signed. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the dynamic shifted, but the economic imbalance only deepened. American factories, protected by two oceans and operating at maximum capacity, produced staggering quantities of war material and consumer goods simultaneously. American GDP expanded dramatically during the war years. Britain, meanwhile, converted its entire economy to military production. Civilian manufacturing ceased, exports collapsed. British companies abandoned markets in South America and Asia, and American firms filled the vacuum. By 1945, the United States controlled 2/3 of global gold reserves and accounted for half of worldwide manufacturing output. London's financial preeminence had migrated to New York. British leaders assumed this sacrifice would be remembered. They believed that because Britain had fought alone from 1939 to 1941, because it had bankrupted itself to hold the line, the Americans would offer generous post-war reconstruction aid. They assumed Lend-Lease would taper gradually, allowing time to rebuild export industries and stabilize the currency. They were wrong. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. Across Britain, people danced in the streets, lit bonfires, and celebrated survival. 7 days later, President Harry Truman signed an executive order terminating Lend-Lease effective immediately. No grace period. No transition. Ships already at sea carrying food and supplies for Britain were ordered to reverse course and return to American ports. The cutoff stunned Whitehall. The economist John Maynard Keynes, serving as an advisor to the government, examined Britain's financial position and saw catastrophe. Britain imported half its food and most of its raw materials, all paid for with Lend-Lease credits. Without those credits, the nation faced mass hunger and industrial paralysis within weeks. Keynes was ill, suffering from the heart condition that would kill him within months. But in September 1945, he sailed to Washington to negotiate emergency financing. He went armed with what he considered a moral argument. Britain had fought for 2 years before America entered the war. It had sacrificed its economy to save Western civilization. Therefore, the United States should provide a grant of $6 billion as retroactive compensation. American negotiators rejected this outright. The war was over. Congress was in no mood to fund European reconstruction, especially for a British government that had just elected a labor majority, promising nationalization and socialism. The Americans offered a loan, not a grant. The amount was $3, $75 billion at 2% interest, repayable over 50 years. The terms were harsh. The most destructive condition was sterling convertibility. Within 1 year of receiving the loan, Britain had to make the pound freely exchangeable for dollars. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies and trading partners to accept payment in pounds while forbidding conversion to dollars. This created a captive market for British goods. The Americans wanted that system destroyed. Keynes argued that immediate convertibility would trigger a financial panic. He was ignored. The alternative to accepting the loan was societal collapse. Parliament voted in favor, many MPs comparing it bitterly to appeasement. Keynes died in April 1946, his health broken. The loan agreement was signed in July. Then came the winter of 1947, the coldest in living memory. Blizzards paralyzed the country. Coal froze in stockpiles. Factories shut down for lack of power. People shivered in dark homes, and bread, never rationed even during the worst of the U-boat campaign, was rationed in peacetime. On July 15, 1947, sterling became convertible, as required by the loan agreement. Within days, a financial stampede began. Countries holding pounds rushed to convert them to dollars. In 5 weeks, Britain lost nearly half the American loan as reserves hemorrhaged. On August 20th, the government suspended convertibility in humiliation. The experiment had failed catastrophically. This financial weakness translated directly into geopolitical retreat. In February 1947, Britain sent a secret message to Washington. It could no longer afford to support Greece and Turkey against Soviet pressure. For a century, Britain had been the guardian of the Eastern Mediterranean. Now the treasury was empty. The message was blunt. If you want to contain communism, you'll have to do it yourselves. This telegram triggered the Truman Doctrine and marked the formal transfer of global leadership from London to Washington. Britain was no longer a superpower. It was a regional power struggling to feed its population. In 1949, with the economy stagnant and reserves depleted, the government devalued the pound from $4, so $3 to $2.80. Overnight, British purchasing power fell by 30%. Imports became more expensive. The cost of living rose. It was an admission that British goods could no longer compete on world markets without currency manipulation. But the true cost of the war extended across generations. The Anglo-American Loan of 1946 was a legal debt obligation with interest. Every year, the British Treasury made payments to the United States Treasury. Through the prosperity of the 1950s, the stagnation of the 1970s, the Thatcher reforms of the 1980s, and the boom of the 1990s, the payments continued. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006. 61 years after victory, the British taxpayer was still paying for the privilege of having survived. This is the answer to the questions we began with. Britain emerged from World War II morally triumphant, but economically shattered. It had traded its financial independence for survival. The mechanism wasn't conquest, it was contract. Through Lend-Lease, forced asset sales, base transfers, and post-war loans, the United States systematically absorbed the wealth and strategic position Britain had built over centuries. Germany lost the war and was occupied. Britain won the war and was indebted. The United States fought the war and emerged as the sole economic superpower, holding the majority of global gold reserves, controlling the world's reserve currency, and possessing military bases spanning the Atlantic. Wars in the industrial age don't have winners in the traditional sense. They have survivors and creditors. Britain survived, but it paid for that survival by liquidating the future. When Churchill wrote to Roosevelt in December 1940, he made the only choice possible. But that choice came with a price tag that wouldn't be settled for 2/3 of a century. If this story gave you a different perspective on the cost of victory, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. History isn't just about what happened, it's about what it cost and who paid the bill.